use the chat box in the beginning.
Yeah, and I can see that you already populated the chat box with your self introduction. So thank you for being polite to Bert. And Bert, welcome. This is great. I'm so excited. We just met last week here in person in brick and mortar mode for a workshop here, but this is a webinar. Even without COVID, it would be a webinar because, as you know, our program students are spread across the country, if not around the world. So this is the best way to engage with them. And if I may just take a few sentences to introduce you, I'll keep myself to a few sentences because otherwise I could speak for an hour introducing you and pointing out your various accomplishments and how you've been, helpful to establish and then this program and continue to help it to excel. But Professor Bert Tussing is obviously from the U.S. Army War College, where he is director of the Homeland Defense and Security Issues Group at the college's Center for Strategic Leadership. He joined the center in October 1999, following nearly 25 years in the United States Marine Corps. So thank you for your service. He is a distinguished graduate of both the Marine Corps Command and Staff College and the Naval War College, and holds master's degrees in national security strategy and military strategic studies. He has served on 3 defense science boards, the Center for Strategic and International Studies Beyond Goldwater-Nichols study, and on the senior advisory group for the Department of Defense Strategy for Homeland Defense and Civil Support. He also is the author of a great volume on defense support of civil authorities that we can really recommend, and also we use it as a textbook here, and he also launched a journal addressing those issues that are not always easily understood. And as a matter of fact, Professor Tussing will tonight also address issues related to his area of expertise regarding Homeland Defense, or defense, and defense support of civil authorities. I should also note that Bert has been involved in the development of the DHS first quadrennial Homeland Security review of 2010, where the 5 core missions and everything of the enterprise that we torture you with in our courses, but that are important to remember, were defined. And he served on an advisory council for the Secretary of Homeland Security in 2013 as well, and was subsequently in 2014 awarded an honorary doctorate in humane letters by Northwestern State University in recognition of his work in Homeland Security, Homeland Defense, and education initiatives surrounding those regimes. So Bert, without further ado, this is your group. Please let us know if you'd like to proceed, if students should, hold questions for later, or how you would like to proceed, and then this is your group.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And I greatly appreciate this opportunity. I've shared with Alexander before that now I realize, of course, that in the worldwide community of Penn State, there's a whole range of wealth of experience and age as well. But anytime I get to talk to someone under the age of 46 is a big deal for me in terms of students. So I'm delighted to be able to share this opportunity with you. I will tell you that Murphy is alive and well. Alison and I worked on this thing this morning. Everything was absolutely wonderful. And now I cannot bring up the slides. However, I have just sent Alison the slides. And if she would like to bring them up, then we can, and I will go through the terrible business of just asking her to advance my slides as I'm going through. My apologies to everyone there. If you like, I can go on without any slides whatsoever, but and you can use the slides later on, or take a look at the slides later on, or Alison, what would you prefer? What can we do at this point? Alison is bringing up the slides, so there we are. Okay. So what we will do is this. Alison can go to there we are in the presentation mode now. And what I will do is I will knock on the table. And every time I knock on the table, Alison, that's going to be an indicator. I just want you to touch, because my slides have I build my slides very deliberately. So with apologies to everyone, and especially apologies to Alison for for making her having to do this for us. I'd like to go forward. Now, you all have already been involved enough in the Homeland Security studies to know that we don't think of Homeland Security as a governmental function. Certainly not just a federal governmental function, but we think of it as a Homeland Security enterprise. But when we talk about that as an enterprise, there are certain functions out of the enterprise that we've got to keep in mind. The first one of those functions, of course, is indeed the federal government. And the federal government is very, very important because it lays out for us, if you will, the framework about which we will operate and orchestrate as a society. But happily for us, the federal government is not the only government that we take into account in these measures, because as a matter of fact, when it comes down to actual implementation of that framework that we talked about, whether we're talking about strategies or operational plans or whatever other initiatives, most of that implementation takes place at state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. That is where, as we say, the rubber meets the road. But happily, as I was saying earlier, it's not just a governmental function at all. There's a whole lot of other people involved in Homeland Security as an enterprise. And a very important component of that, as you all have already, I'm sure, come to know, is the private sector. The private sector's cooperation and private sector partnerships with the public domain cannot be overplayed. And probably the best example or the best illustration of that comes in our discussion of critical infrastructure. You all know the definitions. Basically, infrastructure that is so important, so vital to our country that the disruption of either components of that infrastructure or the infrastructure itself can lead to a set of circumstances that will debilitate the country in terms of security, in terms of economic security, and in terms of national preparedness. Basically, what it breaks down to, and Tussing's correlation to the entire discussion, is you take out the critical infrastructure and you start to unweave the social fabric which we think of as our society. So when we talk about that, most people on the outside who haven't studied it as much as you probably thinks, well, if it's that important, the government must have a real good control of that, must have a great grasp of it, right about the throat, if you will. And that would be, of course, absolutely wrong. Because when we talk about critical infrastructure in these United States, you and I know that 85 to 95% of the critical infrastructure in the United States is owned by the private sector. They control it. In day-to-day operations, they are actually responsible for its security. But that's day-to-day operations, right? And it's not for the operations outside of the norm. Probably we do not expect our bulk power agencies to protect themselves against a terrorist attack, for instance. So there's a cooperative effort that provides for a handoff, if you will, of security operations between the day-to-day operations and the extremist type operations. And therefore, involving the private sector is probably very important in our thinking. The next portion of that Homeland Security enterprise, though, is something else that people don't think of much: non-governmental organizations. We tend to think of non-governmental organizations from the perspective of things that happen outside of the United States. But I will tell you that up until about, I'd say about 30 years ago, you are all familiar at this point, I think, with emergency support functions, laid out very nicely in the National Response Framework, which talks about those vital functions that have got to be preserved and really kind of reinforced, especially in times of crises. And these emergency support functions can be everything from public works to transportations to critical manufacturing to mass casualties, mass care, if you will, temporary housing. Well, up until about, I'd say, as I was saying before, about 30 to 40 years ago, when we talk about the agencies in charge, or the agency in charge of coordinating everything that had to do with mass care, we weren't talking about anybody's government. We were talking about the American Red Cross. And there are other agencies, non-governmental organizations, if you will, that are as deeply involved in our Homeland Security enterprise as the Red Cross. So we've got to be thinking about them. In addition to those, of course, and this is far from intuitive, is this other area that we refer to. If next, please, Alison, click, there we are, our international partners. Now, the truth of the matter is, at least in our psyche, we as a people are frankly quite attuned to the idea of being the friend in need to the global community. I never apologize when I'm overseas talking about these matters with some of our brethren and our allies. I never apologize for the United States, because probably in the history of the world, there has not been a more, if you will, benevolent society than ours. If something goes wrong in the world, we have a tendency to do something in support. We will do it in Africa, we will do it in the Mideast, we will do it in Southeast Asia, from the earthquakes in Indonesia to Pakistan to so on and so on and so forth. We're good at that. What we're not good at is preparing to receive support from the international partnerships. We don't tend to think that we would ever need those, but you and I at this point know that there are things that could happen within these United States that could test every resource that we have, and we would still not have enough. We'll talk in a little bit here about the distinction between major disasters, for instance, and catastrophic incidents or complex catastrophes, and what that means to our people. But I will tell you what it means more than anything else is everything that we have to turn in terms of response and recovery can be activated and still not be enough. It showed up in Katrina, frankly, when we had our allies who really literally arrived at our gates wanting to help, and we were not prepared to receive the assistance. We've gotten better about that, but I would suggest to you that we need to continue to think about those things, particularly as we start to make those distinctions in our minds between disaster, major disaster, and catastrophic incident. But there's more to it than that, to be sure, such as, oh yes, communities. I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that up until about the middle of the last century, emergency management was a matter of community. The government's actual participation in helping communities to respond and recover was limited in many ways and non-existent in others. People seem to forget that the last time we had an almost genuinely catastrophic incident in the United States, by our own definitions, it was the Great Dust Bowl crisis of the 1930s, where 770,000 people were displaced from their homes. And basically at that point, the government did nothing. People forget that Hurricane Katrina was the second time in the 20th century where the city of New Orleans was nearly wiped out, where there was a mass exodus of the New Orleans population north because of major hurricanes. And at that point, the government basically did nothing. Now, obviously, things have evolved over time to where the government has become much more attuned, much more prepared, and much more willing, if you will, to respond to disastrous events. But I would suggest to you that it may be time for us to go back to that mindset that we had at one time that said the response begins here in our communities. And even more importantly, the response begins with our families and the individuals. And that leads us to our next slide, which we will also build here, where we look at what I refer to as the block of resilience. That certainly begins with the nation, but we have to remember that within that nation, we have our communities, and within the communities, we have those families, and within the families, we have those individual components. And if you look upon this block, you can look upon the block as commensurate on the strength of the center. And if the center is not there, then the block will cave in on itself. I share this with you, ladies and gentlemen, because I share it with every audience that I can, whenever I can, because our security as a people, as a society, begins with us and then proceeds from there with those things which are perhaps beyond our individual capabilities or the capabilities of our communities. And every now and then, particularly an audience like this one, who is studying the issues, who is trying, I would suspect over time, trying to move up to positions where they can join in the preservation of our society, you are the people that will occasionally find an opportunity to hear, let's say, complaints about what the government is or is not doing. And people have a right to complain, to be sure. particularly those people who have become, if you will, victims to the disasters. But take that moment, just that moment, if you will, from time to time for me, to say to those individuals, yes, I understand. But by the way, what did you do to prepare for this? And what did you do to prepare to help those people who are beyond the capacity, beyond the capability that you have to prepare, the most vulnerable in our society? And just remind them that, yes, they do have a stake in the game. Okay, so beyond that philosophical context, and a good place to begin our discussions begins with the definitions, and the words are important here. And the series of definitions I wanted to talk about with you now begins with the primary one in our vocabulary here, Homeland Security. You're familiar with this definition. This definition began way back in 2003. It came out of the Homeland Security Council, and they laid it out here the way you see it depicted: a concerted national effort to prevent terrorist attack within the United States, to reduce our vulnerabilities to those to terrorism, disasters, and other emergencies, and to minimize the damage and recover from attacks, major disasters, and emergencies that can occur. But I will tell you, when the definition first came out, well, frankly, the definition only talked about terrorism. And that was important at the time, let's face it, because that's what really led us to where we are right now. But it was not particularly good for all the components of our national security apparatus, even all of the components which have been now combined with the Department of Homeland Security. For instance, I mean, when this definition first came out, there was no discussion of disasters. There was very little discussion about anything other than terrorism itself. So over time, we have evolved in the definition. Next, please, as we build it. So the definition has gone beyond the definition to what I think of as a really good description of what Homeland Security should be. And I would recommend this to your thinking, and once again, put this in your kit bag as you try to explain things to your friends out there about what DHS and what the nation writ large is trying to do for the country. That Homeland Security describes the intersection of the things that threaten our people with the traditional, now listen here, with the traditional government and civic responsibilities of things like civil defense, emergency response, law enforcement, customs, border control, and immigration. Note, please, there that is not just a governmental function. There is a civic responsibility that we always need to retain in the way that we think about things. And then as we go just a little bit further, we get to the whys of all of this. In the military, we tend to address strategies in terms of ends, ways, and means. The ends are always the most important thing. The ways and the means are those things devoted to accomplishing and maintaining the ends. But the end that we are looking for as a people is this one. It is a concerted national effort to ensure a homeland that is safe and secure and resilient against terrorism and other hazards, where the interest of our people, the aspirations of our people, and our way of life can thrive. That's what it's all about. That's what the department is devoted to. But there are two other definitions that I really want to bring up to your attention here, because this is where the intersection of Homeland Security and Homeland Defense come in together. When we talk about Homeland Defense, for those of you, and I saw just briefly in the chat session where there's some of you who have worn the uniform, if you will, this is something we can get our teeth into in the military. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the protection of the United States, our sovereignty, our territory, our people, our critical infrastructure. Snort, scratch, here we go. Against what? Against external threats or aggressions, or any other threat as directed by the President of the United States. But this is something we can grab hold of. This is a great definition, right? Well, yeah, it is, but there are certain portions of this definition which have become, if you will, fuzzy over time. For instance, 500 years ago, when I was still in the Marine Corps and doing something other than talking, I had a physical stake in the game as far as defense was concerned. And I knew who the adversary was. And for most of my career, the adversary was clearly identifiable. They wore red, they were right across the ocean. And if something happened, if something were to happen, we would know who to respond to right at that moment, right? That was the external threat that we were talking about. That was the aggression that we were concerned about. And that still to a real degree exists if the external aggressor identifies themselves. Nation state threats are not as clear as they used to be. Particularly when we go beyond the kinetic to the cybernetic, attribution is a lot harder than it used to be. And then let's take it to one other degree of confusion here, if you will. If Al-Qaeda attacks the United States and claims they attacked the United States, well, that's pretty clear, an external threat. If Al-Qaeda has an identified cell in the United States that accomplishes their will, then that's still kind of a clearly identifiable threat. But if you have a self-designating adherent to the ideals of Al-Qaeda, a lone wolf attack, if you will, or even a group of self-selected citizenry within the United States that attacks the United States in the name of Al-Qaeda, is that an external threat? And it's not quite as clear, nor is it quite as clear on how we respond to that type of individual attack. So the definitions are a little fuzzier than they used to be, and this is something as a free people, we just have to deal with. And then there's this other set of definitions I really want to bring to your attention. What we used to refer to as civil support, and we now refer to as defense support of civil authorities. And note please there, the deliberate wording, support of civil authorities. We changed it. It used to be two civil authorities, but two indicated it was kind of a, if this is what we've got, this is what we're giving you, take it or leave it. Now it's of, what do you need? What additional capability do you need? What additional capacity do you need? But the definition is much more complex than that. Notice please where it says this is support provided in response to request for assistance from civil authority for special events, domestic emergencies, designated law enforcement support, and other domestic activities. Now, obviously, I'm trying to emphasize some things here, so let's go back to those. In response to request, what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is until the request comes from the civil authorities, we don't go. We can be leaning forward as the military often does. I will tell you that the United States Northern Command, as the combatant command that is most directly responsible for the security of these United States within the territorial confines, is always, always, always mindful of the danger of being late to need. And they're always leaning forward, but you can lean forward until you're doing a leaning press, and it doesn't matter if the request does not come. And the request goes through civil authorities to our civil authorities, which includes, of course, the suits at the Pentagon before we make any movement. And then go on to those other things. The domestic emergencies, that you're kind of used to, that's the all hazards sort of thing. But remember, when we talk about these emergencies, they can be natural or man-made. Now, when we talk about man-made, they can be an accident, such as Bhopal was an accident, such as Galveston was back in the 1920s, a horrific event, such as Chernobyl was. Those were all accidents. Those weren't attacks. Or it can be a deliberate diabolical attack. So you have that distinction that you've got to keep in mind, all of those distinctions. And then note, please, designated law enforcement support. Very, very designated, very, very structured, very, very contained, very, very deliberate. Okay, so we've got to keep all of this in our thinking as we go forward. And if it sounds like we're constrained, well, yes, we are, and very deliberately so. Now, the next thing I want to do is kind of lay this all out for you very quickly. And any decent military brief, of course, has got a Venn diagram. By the way, the AAR in the middle of this thing, I have no idea where that is or what it came from. Probably something I did by mistake, so let's cover it. It's not going to go away. All right. But in the middle of it all, of course, is Homeland Security, and then we're also concerned with Homeland Defense. And then finally, beyond all those things, is defense support of civil authorities. When we talk about Homeland Security, we're talking once again about that wonderful intersection of responsibility and hazards. When we're talking about Homeland Defense, we're not talking just about the reaction to what may be out there, but the awareness of a threat, the ability to intercept and defeat the threat before it comes about, ideally, and also the important function of achieving and maintaining mission assurance. And when we talk about mission assurance, we're talking about those missions which have to be maintained. We're talking about, for instance, continuity of operations. We're talking about continuity of government. This is a set of missions that the military is deeply involved in, as you all know, and for relatively obvious reasons. But it doesn't always come to mind intuitively as a Homeland Defense mission. And then when we talk about defense support of civil authorities, well, we're talking about two basic mission sets, if you will. That one mission set that calls for us to provide for consequence management when you're experiencing a disaster, or that other mission set, which I'm continually starting to dance around, you can feel it, where we are going to support law enforcement activities. And in the past, we've done that in terms of counter-narcotic missions on our borders, in terms of other border security missions, in terms of maritime security missions. We'll say something a little more about that in a second. But obviously, we have these overlaps here, and there must be something in the overlap, otherwise it's not a good slide. So, for instance, one of the overlaps is here. You know, back in the good old days, 500 years ago when I was young, when you had an aircraft that was hijacked, basically what it meant more than anything else was you had a plane load of people that were on their way to Cuba. Somebody was trying to make a political statement, so they hijacked the aircraft, they take it into Cuba. It was annoying, it was inconvenient, but that was about it. Of course, all that changed on 9/11, at which time we found out that the hijacking had a much more evil intent. And ever since that time, of course, we have maintained a mission over the American skies to prevent that sort of thing from ever occurring again. So the nature of the threat and the nature of the evil behind the threat has changed us and changed our mindset. Likewise, when we talk about chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or the E stands, believe it or not, for high explosive yield consequence management. Mostly what we're talking about here is hazmat, and you're all familiar with that. And you all know that every major metropolitan area in the United States has a certain hazmat capability. And you know every state has a certain hazmat capability. But what we're talking about here, where the military comes in, is when there is a greater requirement, if you will, a greater degree, if you will, a greater granularity, if you will, on how we respond to things. And that's how we make the distinction. So as you look across the entire mission set here, on the one hand, if you look from your left to right, going from Homeland Security into Defense Support of Civil Authority, you're going to find where the military most often acts in missions within the territorial confines of the United States, and that's in support. However, when the president cries havoc and lets loose the dogs of war within the territorial confines, that's when you're going to see DOD is in the lead. And this is interesting, ladies and gentlemen, because we are arriving at a juncture in our thinking where we realize that DOD may indeed need support in accomplishing its mission within the territorial confines of the United States. Now, what could I possibly mean by that? Well, just quickly, because we've got to move quickly through all of these things. For the entire 20th century, when the President of the United States and Congress of the United States sent our military to war, basically at the beginning, it was a rather casual movement from the forts and the airports of the United States to the embarkation ports, and then they would make their way across the oceans to our enemy shores. And then and only then were we particularly concerned about being able to make our way ashore to do the nation's will. However, as our national security strategy pointed out in the last administration, which is still holding true in this administration, we can no longer think of the homeland as a sanctuary. Those two wonderful oceans that we look upon as moats for most of your and my life are now vectors for our enemies to approach. Those two wonderful neighbors to our north and south, which provided great buffers against our enemies before real concern about attacks against the United States, other than nuclear, to be sure. But the capabilities of our enemies is starting to supersede and extend beyond the buffers of those states. So we've got to think more in lines of not only what DoD has to do, but what needs to be done in order for DoD to do it. And that may call for interagency support to the Department of Defense. It may call for state and local and territorial and tribal government to help facilitate the ability of the Department of Defense to get where it needs to go. We're already starting to talk about a brand new acronym. You know about DSCA now, Defense Support of Civil Authorities. There's a new acronym out there called CISMA, Civil Support to Military Activities. And ladies and gentlemen, this, I would suggest to you, welcomes us to a new reality. And then there's one other area I want you to think about here. DoD's deliberate contributions, not to just supporting our partners, but to enabling our partners. Not only in the United States, but within the territories of our allies and our partner states. Because we've determined over time that those things which we can provide for in terms of capabilities to those partners, when we can turn those responsibilities over to those partners, to other governmental agencies, to whomever, then we've gotten ourselves to the point where, as the old saying goes, rather than giving a man a fish, we're teaching the man to fish. And therefore allowing the United States military to focus back on the day job, which, by the way, is planning for and winning as necessary the nation's wars. All this coming together, of course, to provide for a breadth of security in these United States. But I want to go for a little bit further with you in our discussion here to the next level of consideration for this afternoon. It's what I refer to as the Homeland Security Continuum. Now, you know, over time, that with the National Preparedness Guidelines, you know that we've identified 5 mission states. The first one being prevention, then protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And you all know from your studies, or you will soon know from your studies, that there are governmental agencies in charge of leading the government's efforts, not in charge of doing the government's efforts alone, but leading the government's efforts in each one of these mission areas. However, there are things beyond that consideration that we need to think about as a people, and particularly as professionals who are trying to take over this business. The question of preparedness as opposed to the question of response and recovery. And those of you who've been in the business long know that response and recovery is something that we have become, well, frankly, pretty good at. Okay, the National Response Framework is something that has evolved since the early 1990s. First a Federal Response Plan, then a National Response Plan, then a National Response Framework, which allows us to move out against everything up to and including a major disaster, and within a relatively contained time to meet the requirements of our people, to get them back on their feet, especially in terms of response and the early efforts of recovery. The federal government is there and the state governments take over that. But there are things beyond that that we really need to focus on. And this is something I would suggest to you is recommended by the military's thinking. And one of those things, the first thing, is the question of awareness. Now, I use that term deliberately and somewhat cautiously, because in the military, if we're talking about missions overseas, what we would probably call this is intelligence, right? We want to go immediately to the question of what do we need to know about the situation? What information do we need to gather from whom, under what circumstances? Because we need to be aware, first of all, of the enemy's capabilities, and then secondly, of their, if you will, their posture to do those things and their inclination to do those things. But you can't talk that way within the territorial confines of the United States, because we do not gather information on our people. We even have to be very ginger, if you will, about our approach to criminal organizations. And that has allowed over time for a development in our mindset that makes a distinction between intelligence on the one hand and law enforcement sensitive information on the other hand. And even there, ladies and gentlemen, the alleged criminal element has certain rights which we protect in these United States. So the question of awareness is absolutely essential, but it is one that we have to approach carefully with a great deal of reticence. Not because we are afraid of things, but because we are protective of things, up to and including the rights of our people. And then the final thing in this continuum that I would suggest to your thinking is this one of analysis. After something has been developed as our plan, our strategy, our approach to things, after we have over time shared that strategy, hopefully up and down the chain of command or the governmental chains, then what? Do we wait for something to happen and then say, okay, now we're going to see how well this plan worked out? Or are we going to exercise the plan or the strategy? And once we do that, what do we do with the results of the exercise? Those of you who have been in the military any amount of time, you know what we do with it. We will spend a great deal of time in planning. To build an operational plan amongst any of the combatant commands, it takes us, when I say combatant commands, pardon me, the United States Northern Command, United States Central Command, European Command, Indo-PACOM, Africa Command. When we put together operational plans for those, we will spend, ladies and gentlemen, up to 18 to 24 months to go through the deliberate planning process to bring those things together. And you know what we do as soon as we develop those things? We test them, and we exercise them, and we change them. And it's this constant cycle going on. So this is something I would suggest to you that we need to address in the same way that we address of our requirements in the homeland. We've become very, very good at response and recovery, ladies and gentlemen. I will suggest to you we are not as good in what I would refer to as left of boom in terms of preparedness. We're getting better, but I bring that out to your attention now because you're going to have to go forward and make us better yet as we continue along our always not so merry way. Continuing with our discussion, I want to bring you to this particular area here because it really gets to the notion that I was talking about with the distinction between law enforcement and the military. When we talk about the threats to the homeland, basically they'll go across, as you see, the top of this chart. On the far end of it, we're talking national security threats against our people, against our way of life, our society, as opposed to law enforcement threats, which is still threatening to our people, but it is not trying to unravel our society, right? That would be like killing the golden goose, right? Now, the ultimate manifestation of national security threats, of course, is war, okay? And that's clearly a military type operation. And these are the sorts of things that you see in war. And on the other side of things, the manifestation of law enforcement threats is crime. And crime, law enforcement activities specifically designated to prevent or to, if you will, make crime pay. So, but in between those things, we have what I refer to as the theme of ambiguity. And it's those things which are not clearly and totally military or not clearly and totally law enforcement. One area I referred to a little while ago, maritime security. You know, up until a certain point off of the coast of the United States, anything that happens within the territorial confines is almost always a law enforcement type issue. And beyond that point, it becomes more of a defense type issue. But it's not always clear. Now, I will tell you that there's a terrific example on how to deal with this ambiguity laid out by the United States Coast Guard and the United States Navy in a cooperative effort that they refer to as Maritime Operational Threat Response, where they, as entities, literally see a threat coming towards the United States and say, it's yours, it's mine, that sort of thing. But those sorts of cooperative efforts do not characterize everything that we have to deal with in this ambiguity. When you look at border security, you may be thinking mostly, well, I mean, really, Bert, when was the last time somebody tried to come across the border of the United States and attack us? Okay, Pancho Villa has been in the grave for a very long time, and the Canadians, whereas they might not like the jokes, they aren't really ready to attack us, are they? But then the question becomes, okay, so where's our distinction? Is everything just a matter of being concerned about holding the borders of the United States for what we hold to be a societal norm? Or is there something beyond that? Are we concerned about really holding back the Guatemalans and the Hondurans and the Mexicans and the rest of Central America that we see coming across in droves? Or are we concerned that among those huge numbers, there may be Algerians or Sudanese or things like this. And I'm not making these things up, ladies and gentlemen. These are documented. So there is concern here. As you look across the bottom of the chart, you see where the federal responsibilities are divided. Basically, with law enforcement right now, Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. Within the national security requirements, obviously the main component there is the Department of Defense. But then there are even other areas, as we see developed over time, which are sticking themselves in that seam of ambiguity that makes it just not quite as clear. Those of you who are studying the issues know that even within the federal component, there are only three major federal agencies that are charged with cybersecurity: Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and the Department of Defense. And you know, if you've got three big governmental organizations like that, we must surely have control of this baby, or maybe not so much. But these are some of the things that we've got to deal with, folks. And these are challenges which will never be solved. It's going to be a matter of mitigation as we continue to deal with the problems. And then beyond the seam of ambiguity, another area I want you to look at here is what I refer to as a question of balance. Now, the problem with the active duty of the United States military is that, and I hate to say this to them because it usually has a tendency to raise a lot of eyebrows, but they're feds, ladies and gentlemen. They are feds. They work for the federal government. They think like federal government. That's it, okay? And so I need to remind most of my students here at the Army War College that there is a derivation, a delegation of responsibility that is shared and religiously protected on both sides of this issue. On the one hand, the President of the United States at any given moment can jump up and down on his or her desk, pound their chest and say, listen, according to Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States, I am responsible, I am authorized to protect the citizenry of the United States and take whatever steps needs to be necessary. At which time, 54 other sovereigns who do not reside at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, that call themselves governors of the United States and the territories of the United States, jump up on their desk and say, listen, pal, I'll see your second article and I'll raise you a 10th Amendment that says anything not specifically delegated to you resides with the people, and that be us. And you know what? They're both right. They are both right in their positions. And they are both right in being somewhat territorial about their separate constituencies. And we have to think about that. Now, my active component friends, they have a tendency to say, listen, once they call for help, why don't they just get out of the way and let us provide the help? And then we'll steal away like heroes in the night and everything will be fine. Well, that sounds good, but I want you to go back just a moment ago in your thinking to what I referred to as that Homeland Security Continuum, that protection, prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. When it comes to the actual federal response, once something has gone bad, the federal government comes in only after they're invited by the governors of the United States or their legislatures and extremists, and they will do all that they can to get the citizenry back on their feet, to stop the loss of life, to stop the human suffering, to stop the greater devastation of property. And then they want to leave. Now, if you're the governor of one of these states or territories, and the populace of your constituency is of an opinion that the only thing that was there to save them in times of crises were the green-clad monsters that you and I have grown to know and love, called the United States Army, the United States Marine Corps, etc., then what does that do amongst that constituency to retain the trust and confidence in the people for the rest of recovery and all, for the rest of response and all of recovery? So I have to remind my students from time to time that this is not a rice bowl issue. This is an elemental issue of leadership. And oh, by the way, the governors probably have a far greater grasp of what is the requirements in their particular states and territories than the President of the United States, as, by the way, does their National Guard have a far greater understanding of the requirements and, oh, by the way, the officials that you'll be dealing with in helping the state to recover. Something else for us to think of. And then there's this component of it, framing the issue in reality. And I'm going to go through this quickly because I've got to go through everything quickly now. Back a little while ago, a great American named Tim Lowenberg, who for 12 years was the Adjutant General of the state of Washington, a pioneer in these areas. And unfortunately, we lost him about 4 years ago. But he had what he referred to as the Division of Disaster. And it goes something like this. And by the way, this is something that I've done to bastardize it over time. And Tim even had to come back to me about it. And you'll see why here in a second. But his Division of Disaster begins like this. 94% of all emergencies are handled locally. 94%. That's why we have fire departments. That's why we have police departments. That's why we have emergency medical technicians. 4% of the time, those disasters or those emergencies that may have grown a little bit will involve state agencies. Because you all know intuitively, if not factually, from your own experience, you know that basically the way we approach problems is all emergencies are local. And if you exceed the capabilities or the capacity of the localities, then they reach out to adjoining localities. And if they can't help you, then you reach out to the state for additional help. That leaves, okay, math for Marines here, 94.4. That leaves only like 2% of the time where you genuinely need a federal response. But here's the thing. When that 2% comes up, most of the states want it yesterday. So that's why the federal government is leaning as forward as far as it is. And that is why the state governments in times of crises occasionally will find themselves complaining about the responsiveness of the federal government. But keep in mind too, that the states don't want them until they want them, and then they really, really want them. Something else for us to think about. And then there's another analogy I wanted to share with you all, what I refer to as Cummins' transitive law of disaster. A friend of mine, a great Air Force officer who became a contractor over time named Chip Cummins. And he had this to say about it. Now, by the way, 500 years ago, I was an English literature major at the Citadel, so I don't do math. This is closer than you'll ever get from me. But it goes like this. You remember the transitive law that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C? Well, it goes like this. First of all, as you all know, all disasters are local. And as the late, great Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House of the United States Congress, famously said, all politics are local. That's right. And therefore, we can discern, yes, indeed, all disasters are political. And there is absolutely a political element in there. And it's inescapable and it's completely understandable. But oh, by the way, there's Tussing's correlation to this thing. All disasters are local, all politics are local, all disasters are political. In my extension, all politics is disastrous, but that's not the point I'm trying to make here. I'm trying to inspire you or instill in your minds that this is something that we've got to think about as we go forward in these areas. Next slide, please. Continuing our bill. Now, DOD wants to be there for the American people at all times. It truly, truly does. But as I said a little while ago, it has this day job that you kind of expect us to do, and that's preparing for and fighting and winning the nation's wars. And oh, by the way, if we run out of assets, nobody expects the New York City Police Department to come aboard with us in an attack on Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So you see the distinction, and you see what occasionally may seem to be a selfish attitude as DOD goes forward. And it has played out over time in what I refer to as a philosophy. The first component of that philosophy is this: DOD is in support of civil authorities. The DOD is in support of civil authorities. Now, I've said that to you several times, and you can accept it mentally, but intuitively, you might not be willing to just take that in. Because when a 6'5" general officer shows up wearing 6 stars, if you read them from left to right, 3 on this shoulder, 3 on that shoulder, 6 stars, then you expect that guy to be in charge. But the truth of the matter, ladies and gentlemen, is this: they don't want to be in charge. Ideally, what they would like to do is to arrive on site with additional capabilities or capacities that the civil element does not have and say, what do you need? Where do you need it? Or even above that, what would be great is, why don't we do this according to the plan that you and I put together, which hardly ever happens. But the point here I want you to go away with is this: DoD is in support. Here's the next thing. Civil resources and capabilities should be used first. Now, this sounds greedy, but let's face it. If you have capability there to do what needs to be done, then you shouldn't be calling for the military. And oh, by the way, the military's price tag is far more severe than what you might have in civil and local authorities, because the military employs itself the same way it does in war. We will bring operational, logistical, and everything else with us, and the tail is occasionally more expensive than the teeth. But you need to keep that in mind. And here's another thing we want you to keep in mind. Missions are limited in duration and in scope. Back when I was still in the military 500 years ago, when General Powell was the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had the Powell Doctrine. And basically the Powell Doctrine began with, what is the mission and what is the exit criteria? At what point do we know that we have been there long enough to accomplish what needs to be done, and then we can leave? That is instilled in our mindset, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I will tell you, I think equally instilled in the mindset of a lot of civil authorities is they're going to hold on to that green-clad hero as long as they possibly can. But that's not the point, and that's not the intent. Likewise, I want you to be thinking about this one. Response here is a total force effort. I'm not going to dwell a long time on that because this is something I really want to get into my active duty students' mindset. But when we talk about response with the military's efforts, we're talking about the active component, we're talking about the service reserves, and we are certainly talking about the National Guard. Very, very important in our distinctions here and in how we build things. And then there's this one. A lot of people saying, well, that's a rather selfish attitude once again, but nope, nope, nope. Support should be provided on a cost reimbursable basis, either as delineated in the Economy Act, which basically says any federal agency which asks for support from another federal agency will pay for said support, or the Stafford Act, which more of you are familiar with, which basically says, okay, feds, when you come to town with your capability, we will pay for what you use. Well, not so fast, really, Bucky. Because what we're really talking about here at the end of the day is the Stafford Act only calls for about 25% of reparations of the assets that are actually expended. And here's another fun fact for you. DoD does not budget for responding to major disasters or worse yet, catastrophic events. So this is coming right out of Hyde. So you see why DoD is just a little more pensive about providing this kind of support from time to time. But let's go on. The next thing I want you to look at is what I want to describe as the Defense Support of Civil Authorities mission set. Basically, we have three separate mission categories: domestic emergencies, designated law enforcement, and other activities. Designated law enforcement. We'll get back to that. When we talk beyond that, we're talking about four types, right? Disasters and declared emergencies, that you might expect. Support or restoration of public health and civil order. National security, special security events, and periodic plan support. When we look at the examples of those sorts of things, it's the kind of thing that you have seen played out. Natural disasters or natural disasters or natural disasters or disasters, even man-made type disasters. And we'll stop short of talking about war, but I want you to put that one in the back of your mind. And when we go to national special security events, you're familiar with some of those. You see them played out all the time. If the Olympics comes to town, we have military support there. The inauguration, military support there. Super Bowl, military support there. All those things. And periodic plan support. Those sorts of things that you see occasionally from time to time, which is a way of connecting the military to its society when there's not many opportunities like that for us. But then there's that one I skipped over, the one right here, the one that will really get people's attention. This is the one that I will tell you, I have yet to meet the general officer in the United States that said, yeah, baby, I want some of that. As soon as they're called to these missions, you can hear the South Korean teeth sucking sound in a second. Oh my goodness. Now why? Why are they so concerned about that? What's the distinction? Why are we so shaky about using the military for law enforcement? Well, let's go on here. The quick answer, if you will, is Posse Comitatus. If you know anything about that, especially you military people, you say, well, Posse Comitatus says that the active component of the United States military may not be used in direct support to law enforcement. Okay, they can't do it, but you know what? That's the active component, federal forces, not the National Guard. And that's where my active component guys like to really jump on it. Says, hey, no, sir, you know, the National Guard can get in there, and they can, if told by their governors, while under their governor's control, they can. But I will tell you once again, I've never met a National Guard general officer who says, yeah, I want some of that. No question about it. They're not anxious. And you want to know why? It's very, very simple. Soldiers are soldiers, and policemen are policemen. Soldiers are trained in one mindset. Policemen are trained in another. Like I told you, 500 years ago when I was actually doing something, if I had a Marine that was raising his or her weapon to her shoulder and did not intend to fire downrange, like right then, I'd rip their lips off, because while they're thinking about doing something, someone downrange has already made a decision and sent rounds down your way, taking either your dumb exterior out or the individuals depending upon you to your right or to your left. That's the way we think in combat. That's not the way policemen think, okay? That's not the way that policemen think. And that's the way our people expect us to be. Because we want our soldiers to be soldiers, we want our policemen to be policemen. We want our military to be our servant and never, ever, ever our overseer. And that's what leads us to what I'm going to stop with as the Posse Comitatus ethos that separates the military mind set from others. When we say Posse Comitatus, there is a law put on the books in 1878 that basically said that the military may not do law enforcement stuff directly. By that, I mean regulatory power, I mean prescriptive power, or I mean compulsory type power, okay? Not for us. And what does that translate to? Those of you in law enforcement, these will come up to you intuitively, but it means we may not interdict, we may not arrest, we may not stop and frisk, we may not search and seize, we may not gather collect evidence, we may not interrogate, we may not surveil our people. That is not the way the servants in our military provide for our populace. So the distinction here is an important one, and one that we will preserve. And the good news for you and me is that this isn't something that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines have to learn. Because in this all-volunteer force which currently serves you in uniform, ladies and gentlemen, the same thing which just doesn't sit right in your gut as citizens won't sit right in the guts of your military. So that's the distinction. Now, folks, I've got to apologize because we got a little bit a late start here, and I was a little bit because we had such a hard time in getting things up. I didn't get through things as fast as I would like to have. But the rest of my slides will be made available to you. And do this for me. Alison, go to the very last slide, please. Nope, oh, that's too bad. These were good things. The very last one, down at the bottom. No, that's not it. Very last slide. There we go. Oh, you're not going to show that to them? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, that last slide has my name, it has my telephone number, and it has my email address. What you all are doing, I think, is extraordinarily important. And those of you who are planning on to go on and serve in these areas, I think are about to embark upon something which is essential to our people. if I can be of assistance to you sometime, then please do me the honor of reaching out. As Alexander will tell you, as things progress here, we are starting a cooperative effort between the United States Army War College and Penn State, beginning there at Penn State Harrisburg, where we're going to be bringing students aboard as interns. We're going to be doing collaborative efforts with our faculties, because both of what we are doing is essential for our people. So, with apologies for having gone on too long, if Alexander or Alison will allow me to take just a few questions, I would love to do that.
Great,
Okay.
Thank you, Bert. First of all, no apologies necessary. Thank you for your time and for your engagement with our students. And also, thank you for your kind remarks on our advancing and enhanced collaboration between our two great institutions. I would also take a moment to recognize Linda Wackerman, who I am only realizing now is attending. Linda Wackerman is retired Rear Admiral from the Navy and a graduate of our program. Linda and I had a lot of fun and in the capstone course and the 594 course. But Linda also serves on the advisory council of Penn State Homeland Security program. So Linda, I wanted to take a moment to recognize you. Thank you for attending. And thank you for continuing support. Alison, can I ask you, because Bert indicated that he is fine with the slide deck being shared, maybe you can just post it on the chat so that those who are around here can download it, and then we'll also be more than happy to make it available upon request. And then also, thank you, Linda, very kind. Thank you for your comment on the chat. And may I suggest that if you have questions for Bert, can you very briefly put them on the chat so we can go, or Bert has a chance for a comprehensive response. I think that would be best in the interest of time, because I don't want to keep everybody too long, and I believe in the academic quarter. However, while you are typing your questions, if somebody has a particularly interesting or convoluted question that they would like to rather, speak out, then write down. You can also raise your hand, and then Alison can give you speaker rights, and you can verbally pose your question to Bert.
Folks, this is a great opportunity. It's not like being stuck in a classroom where if you raise your hand, you've got everybody else stuck there. People can walk away if they like.
That's right. That's the new teaching style, right? And everything is a little more flexible, but we believe we have had the experience here that we also get more critical thinking out of these webinars and more challenging questions. So we actually like it. Bert, maybe I can be the icebreaker here while others are thinking. Thank you for the fantastic overview, and looking at what we expect to come out of the White House as the new Biden national security strategy, as we have seen the interim national strategic guidance. So in that guidance, other than the national security strategy of 2017, doesn't present a pillar structure of national security where Homeland Security would be one pillar and then others would follow. So do you think that the continuum model that you referenced and that we also teach and also use as a blueprint for our research activities, do you think this Homeland Defense and Security and National Security Continuum model that we've been lecturing about, is that going to continue? Because we thought it would be like, it was nice to see it mirrored at national security level, and it all started with Obama, with these pillars where Homeland Security was operationally integrated. And then also strategically with Homeland Security was operational, strategically integrated with national security. Now with the idea on fostering and enhancing liberal values globally, which is also important. Do you think that continuum model will more become an analytic endeavor, or do you think it will be practically and strategically as striking and guiding as it used to be over the past few years?
I think it will be, Alexander. I think as you know, and as your students either know or they will come to know, each one of those conceptual blocks, prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery, has got a federal interagency operation plan tied to it, developed to it. This is how we are focusing our efforts. And the focus here, ladies and gentlemen, is very, very important. The words are very, very important. I will tell you, and Admiral Ackerman may join me in this. When we were youngsters, you would see these things come out, and it sounded like so many bumper stickers, right? There didn't seem to be any there. But the words behind all of this are absolutely essential, because if you cannot tie your effort, your resources to what is being described in these documents, then you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to be supported. Your programs won't be developed. And more importantly, the functions those programs are trying to support will not be developed. So those things themselves are philosophically sound, and I think they will remain that way. Where we're seeing a new direction, Alexander, as you know, and ladies and gentlemen, I would recommend this to your thinking, is and how we're going about that critical infrastructure that I talked about in the lecture. We are going beyond the critical infrastructure as individual sectors to what the relatively new Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is referring to as national critical functions. And though the different sectors are coming together to and being analyzed together as fulfilling those functions, because we've determined over time that the infrastructure sectors are absolutely interdependent, and they are vulnerable. And if you take out one sector, you're going to feel it in another, to where the overarching categories of supply and distribution and management will be unhinged. So that new thinking and the Department of Homeland Security through CISA is going to take a slightly different direction, I think, in how we look at critical infrastructure and we go about protecting it.
Great.
I have a question.
We have two questions in the chat, and I think we'll have to leave it at that. Do you see the questions, Bert? One is by Linda, and then the other is by Carrie. If you would like to address those, please.
Okay, good.
Great, thank you.
Let me go with the student first, and then to the Admiral. You mentioned the United States is getting better at accepting help from other nations. Could you share what type of things are being done to improve in this space? That's a very good question. Out of Katrina, one of the things that came out of that was we literally had people, as I said, almost lined up at the border to bring things across. And whereas during Katrina, at the beginning of Katrina, we were not prepared to take that. In response to Katrina, the Army division down there at the time, it was First Army, and since that time we've changed things again. But the Army was told to open up the borders and allow the support to come in. That was unheralded. That was never even envisioned before. Since that time, we've gone from reaction to planning for accepting this sort of support. So, were we to experience another Katrina, were we to experience a Sandy, if you will, were we to experience a nearly catastrophic event like the earthquakes, we now have agencies within the Department of Homeland Security which are directing their efforts towards planning for the not only the reception but the best implementation of those assets. So we're getting better at it, but we've got a long way to go, because still in most of our minds we can't envision that need. Admiral Mem, are we seeing any headway with how we mobilize Title X forces for DISCA, especially given lessons learned this past year with the COVID support? Let me suggest, ma'am, to begin that I'm not sure what lessons we have learned thus far from the COVID support. The problem that I think we're going to be dealing with with the COVID crisis, one of the big problems that we're dealing with gets back to that fundamental sovereignty issue among the states. You know, the federal government, I would contend, knowing some of the people, for instance, who worked in Operation Warp Speed, the federal government had a decent framework, but when it came down to implementation, almost in anticipation of the states responding as they frequently will, don't tell us what to do. The federal government made the vaccines available. The federal government provided for, if you will, the first vestiges of distribution of the vaccines, but they left it to the states to decide how they were actually going to distribute the vaccines among their populace. And as a function of that, those of us who are watching it, as I know most of your students are, can be taken back by the fact that West Virginia had what appeared to be a phenomenal model of getting the vaccine distributed to their people. And other states, such as Pennsylvania, seem to be a little less together in the operation. And the reason for that, frankly, is a sovereignty issue which manifested itself on the darkest side. This leads me to something I believe that Alexander has heard me say before, and something that we are encouraging as mightily as we can. The federal government can well be held back from mandating to states to do what they think the states need to do. Because if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. And the population, the mindset, the social structure, all of those things may be markedly different. However, what the federal government can do is bring in the best and the brightest from the states, from the communities within the states, from private sector, from academic institutions, and say, how should we address these problems? And not develop mandates, but templates to be distributed to the states. And even at that moment, in a spirit of humility, if you will, going forward and saying, this might not be the exact answer or the final answer for your particular populace, but it's probably a very good place to begin. And not just for states, but for major metropolitan areas, medium-sized metropolitan areas, things like that. There is a better approach to things, but it has to begin with a two-sided issue, if you will, a spirit of unity and a spirit of humility in order to bring the right people to the right place at the right time for the right cause. And that was, I went on for some time there, probably didn't answer your question well, but it gets me to the end of it.
Thank you, Bert. That's been wonderful. So that's been a fantastic evening. This has been very insightful. Thank you very much. Also, thank you for your consent to us sharing the slide deck. Next week, a great colleague of yours will be presenting, Charles Du, who is from Hawaii and is a former member of Congress. But also served in the Hawaii State House and in Honolulu City Council. And Bert, like you said, you know, the different tiers of government and not always very easy to reconcile because both or every level can cite certain constitutional rights and entitlements, if you will. Charles will be the perfect expert to expand on that and discuss and bring to the table Homeland Security from different perspectives, the level of different tiers of government that he has experienced himself as a public servant, a politician, an expert, and a uniformed service member. So I hope you'll join us again next week. So with that, once again, thank you very much, Bert, for speaking to this group here. I'm excited about our evolving collaboration. I would like to wish you all a very nice evening, good rest of your week, and hope to see you here next Monday, same time, same place. Take care. Bye-bye. And thanks, Alison, again for running the show technically here. Bye-bye. Good to see everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex.
Recording off.